My family mocked me for being a barista, gave my childhood home to my brother. Now he's begging me a store after I built a $10 million business. Hello everyone, my name is Paul. I am 32 years old and reside in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. My best friend Brian and I currently run 21 coffee shops in 5 states. We began this endeavor 5 years ago with a little rented apartment and nothing but our savings, no loans, no assistance from family. Even though I now have a secure career, a nice income, and a home worth about $600,000, I prefer to live quietly. Unlike many others, I avoid discussing my accomplishments. That choice is based on an event that occurred 7 years ago. Back then, in a state of pride, I tried too hard to prove myself and said too much at the wrong time. My father and younger brother made me pay for it. Since that day, I vowed to myself that no matter how far I went, or how successful I became, I would never brag about my accomplishments, especially in front of my family. But last Christmas, I breached my promise. I slipped and spoke one line that was innocent at the time, but that was all they needed. The exact people who formerly looked down on me now have the opportunity to tear me down in front of everyone. Aunt Ingrid called me in early December of last year, just as the Christmas joy had spread to every street corner. I hadn't heard her voice for 7 years. After a few cautious greetings, she requested if I might come home with the entire family for this year's Christmas gathering. I remained mute for a long time at that point, ready to say no like I had so many times before. But before I could say anything, she kindly continued, "Everyone misses you." I could not respond immediately, but that night I was unable to sleep. I wasn't sure if they truly missed me or if they only missed the previous version of me, the one who was weak. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps a part of me still wanted to believe in something positive. Regardless, I chose to return. On Christmas Day, over 2 hours after driving from Portland to Salem, I arrived in front of her house at 11 a.m. While I was looking for a parking spot, a familiar voice screamed out from behind me on the right, loud enough to be heard throughout the yard. 7 years and you're still driving that thing? Looks like nothing's changed. I turned around. It was Peter, my cousin. He was resting against a brand new SUV, arms crossed, with a grin that was both sarcastic and satisfied. I looked at him for a few seconds, exhaled quietly through my nose, and smiled without saying anything. I did not want Peter to get to me. I did not come back here to argue with anyone. After I parked, I took the present bag I had packed the night before. Inside, there were a few bottles of wine, not expensive but nice enough to demonstrate respect. As soon as I entered the living room, I recognized 2 people I hadn't seen in 7 years, my father and my younger brother. They stood in the corner of the room, near the large Christmas tree against the wall. Their gaze lingered on me for only 3 seconds before immediately moving away. I didn't walk up to them. Instead, I nodded to the surrounding family, asked a few polite inquiries about job and health, and smiled just enough to be nice. Aunt Ingrid emerged from the kitchen only a bit later. When she saw me, she removed her oven mitts, ran over to me, and hugged me tightly. Her voice trembled, yet it had a weird warmth to it. "Welcome home." At that point, I wondered if this time would be different. Perhaps now, after 7 years away, I'll finally feel like I belong here, if only for a moment. But I had no idea that today would mark the start of another fall, this time in front of everyone. The celebration began approximately 15 minutes after I arrived. I sat at the end of the table, near to some younger cousins. Looking around, I realized it had been a while since my family had assembled in such a large group. All of the traditional Christmas foods were served, including roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, buttered rolls, cream soup, and numerous trays of homemade sweets. I looked at how everything was arranged, observed the hot dishes were still steaming, and realized Aunt Ingrid had spent the entire morning preparing it all. Aunt Ingrid is my mom's younger sister. Mom used to swing by our house on a regular basis, bringing sweet pastries and bags of sun-warmed fruit from her lawn. However, after Mom's death nearly 10 years ago, Aunt Ingrid became increasingly distant. My father was the reason she stopped visiting. I remember the few times she stopped by after the funeral. My father didn't bother trying to hide his annoyance. When he opened the door, he would frown and make casual remarks about how we didn't deserve anyone's sympathy. Once, as my brother and I were laughing and chatting with her, he stood up and said, "If that's the kind of visit this is, don't bother, I can take care of my kids." After that, I never saw her again. Return to that day's celebration. About 30 minutes into the lunch, just as laughter began to rise from the far end of the table, Peter's father, Uncle Andrew, turned to face me. His voice broke through the background noise in the room. "So, Paul, still working at the coffee shop?" At that point the room appeared to pause. Almost everybody turned to stare at me. I could sense them waiting for a response. Uncle Andrew posed that question because he had a brief work trip to Portland 3 years prior. By chance he came into one of my coffee shops. 2 staff had called in sick with the virus that day, and the store was crowded. So I donned the costume and stepped in to assist, just like any other barista. When he stepped in and spotted me behind the counter in uniform, he stopped for a little minute. I could see the surprise in his eyes, but he said nothing. I did not explain. I nodded at him as I would any other customer, and carried a coffee over to the corner table. I never expected him to bring it up again, but a few days later, the texts started flooding in. Sarcastic text messages, some with laughing emojis and a photo of me in uniform. It didn't take long to figure out where everything started. One night, my father sent me a message. There's no build-up, just one sentence. "You embarrassed me." I didn't respond. At that point, my father and I had long lost touch. 3 years later, in the middle of a Christmas party, Uncle Andrew brought it up again, seizing the opportunity to take a jab. His tone was firm, yet his eyes conveyed mockery. I sat quiet, my hand resting on the spoon, thinking I'd just let it go as I always did. But something inside of me altered. Maybe it was my father's stray glance across the table. Perhaps it was a faint laugh from a neighboring relative. I lifted my head, looked straight at Uncle Andrew, and calmly replied, "Yes, I still do. But now as the co-founder of 21 coffee shops across 5 states. After I stated that, the table became quiet. Even the clinking of silverware ceased. I spotted some people exchanging glances. Some simply stared at me. Then suddenly, Peter, Uncle Andrew's kid, broke into laughter. He slumped back in his chair, shaking his head, and exclaimed, "Oh man, listen to this guy. It sounds like one of those TikTok lads discussing their million-dollar enterprise." That was some wild fiction. A few others chuckled. One of my aunts on the left nodded and added, just loud enough, "Yeah, founder, but are you still serving tables?" Something about that does not add up. Someone joined in. Exactly. Anyone can say that. I could likewise declare myself the owner of a 5-star restaurant if all I did was talk. The amusement began to spread around the table, in the form of glances, nods, and discreet snickers that were not hidden. At that point, I looked around the room and felt as if I had just become a joke in the middle of a circus, with my family serving as the audience. Surprisingly, I did not feel ashamed. The only thing I saw were my father's eyes. He was not laughing. He did not speak. He simply stared at the wine glass in front of him, as if he had just heard something he hadn't fully absorbed yet. About a minute after I stopped speaking, as the last bits of laughter faded, the area around the dinner table sank into an undefined silence. It seemed like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. I just sat there, my hand lightly resting on the edge of the chair, with no powerful emotions remaining inside me. My father then spoke, exactly as I had expected. His speech was low, quiet, and carefully controlled. "You are embarrassing me. Who do you think you are, claiming to run 21 coffee shops? Would you keep driving that old automobile if you were that successful?" After those remarks, I turned to face him. His face was flushed scarlet, and his gaze was unwaveringly fixed on me. The tension at the table was so intense that it felt frozen in the air. A few seconds later, my younger brother Brody spoke from across the table. This time his voice was louder and sharper. "You are always like this. Always trying too hard to stick out. Working in a coffee shop, getting caught in uniform, and still acting like you're unique." After hearing everything, I didn't say anything. I only raised one brow slightly and took a slow, deep inhale. I heard my father's wine glass slam into the table. The sound was loud enough to draw everyone's attention back. The next minute, he sprang up, gazing at me as if he had discovered something filthy in his home. He yelled, "Get out of here, and never show your face to this family again. You are a disgrace." That was when I realized I didn't have a reason to stay. Not because I was hurt, but because I finally saw things clearly. The folks who once called me family were merely waiting for an opportunity to kick me out again. This time they did it publicly and without compassion. Just as I slid my chair back to stand, a distinct and powerful voice came from the head of the table. "That is enough, Caleb. You should leave this party, not Paul. Remember, this is my house. You are a guest, and you have no right to kick someone out of my home." The whole room froze. The voice came from Aunt Ingrid, which surprised everyone. Her tone was not loud, but it was piercing enough to cause the entire table to stop breathing for a few seconds. She gazed at my father, her eyes devoid of their customary tenderness. She wasn't upset, but the way she stood up, kept her back straight, and delivered each phrase made the room feel heavier than any raised voice could. She then turned to Uncle Andrew. Her voice remained steady, but she did not hold back this time. "Andrew, I hope this is the last time you mock someone in my house. The same goes for Peter. Teach your son some respect." Peter looked down at the table, and Uncle Andrew murmured under his breath, I'm sorry, Ingrid." His apologies were so low that only those nearest could hear them. I was not startled by Aunt Ingrid's statements. I knew she could see everything. She simply chose not to interfere. But tonight, she stood up for me, right there at the table, in front of everyone who had for years treated me like an outcast. She turned back to face me. Her gaze softened, and her voice sank, steady but warm. "Stay, Paul. As long as I'm here, no one will push you around." At that point, I could hear the protection in her voice. I nodded slightly, glanced at her and said, "Thank you, Auntie. But I have something at the shop I need to take care of." That line was simply an excuse to depart, and I knew she understood. But instead of trying to stop me with words, she simply sighed and murmured, "Then wait a moment for me." About 10 minutes later, as I buttoned up my coat and went onto the front porch, she returned with a nicely prepared bag of food. She placed it in my hands, looked at me, and said nothing. At that moment I felt a sting rise in the bridge of my nose. Not out of sadness, nor out of appreciation. It was the quiet anguish of knowing that after all these years, someone in my family still cared enough not to let me leave empty-handed. About 2 hours later, I arrived at a familiar Portland location. Everything was as it had always been. The sound of grinders buzzing, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee in the air, and mellow jazz playing from the ceiling speakers. As I stepped in, a couple staff members behind the desk nodded quickly at me. I returned it with a little nod, and the same familiar smile I'd worn every day for the past 5 years, even on the toughest days. When I approached the bar, Luca, who was at the time operating the machine, stood aside without saying anything. He did not require me to say anything. Luca, like every other barista in our stores, knew I like making my own coffee, especially at the end of the day, or after something that had left my head racing. About 10 minutes later, I returned my cup to my customary location by the window. It was private enough yet close enough to see the full cafe. I sat down, placed the cup on the table, and leaned back in my chair, as if I had returned to the safest place I knew. After the first few swallows, the beans' mild bitterness and hint of acidity began to re-energize my body. My head began to clear. But when I looked through the enormous glass pane, I realized I remembered what happened 7 years ago. Not because I wanted to, but after what happened this afternoon, that memory seemed jolted back into the present, sharp, vivid, and still holding that familiar hurt someplace deep in my chest. 7 years ago, on a Sunday afternoon, I had just returned home from work when I noticed my father sitting in the living room with a newspaper barely past the second page. He beckoned me over and said he needed to talk about something. His tone was calm, as if he were about to discuss something utterly ordinary. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. My younger brother was also present, seated in the corner of the table with his headphones on, but I noticed him peek over when our father began speaking. My father looked me directly in the eyes and said, "I intend to leave this house to your brother. He needs a stable place to start after graduation." I sat still for a few seconds. The line was brief, yet it struck me in a manner I couldn't articulate. I asked him again, this time with a low yet clear voice. "What about me?" He answered without looking at me and without hesitation. "You already have a job. You make good money. You can take care of yourself. Your brother might not land a decent job after school like you did. To maintain my composure, I gently clasped my hands in my lap. Then I inquired, "Do you remember who's been covering most of his senior year tuition?" "A guy who's only been working for a little over a year, sending money back every month like clockwork on the 15th. No one replied. My brother was still wearing his headphones, but he had clearly ceased the music a long time ago. I stared at him directly and questioned, "You don't have anything to say?" He didn't look back and just replied, "This is Dad's decision, I'm not getting involved." I nodded gently, without saying anything else. That night, I packed my belongings and moved out. No arguments. Nobody begged me to stay. Everything transpired in a peculiar silent way, as if they were waiting for me to depart. I have not gone back since that day. I made a mistake 7 years ago by telling them how much I made. I had recently graduated and landed a position at a financial firm. My annual income after taxes was no less than $70,000, and I brag about it to my father. Following that, I learned to live. I stopped bragging to anybody and kept my salary to myself. After my father said that he would leave the house to Brody, I didn't say anything else. That night, I packed my belongings, called a ride, and left with only the old backpack I had used in college. Nobody saw me off. Nobody called after me. I got a modest apartment on the outskirts of Portland, more than 30 minutes away from work. It wasn't particularly large or fancy, but it was clean and quiet enough for me to start anew. At the time, I wasn't making a tiny wage. Working in finance, I earned more than $70,000 a year after taxes. That was more than enough to cover my basic needs. But when I left home, I decided to live modestly. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to experience what it was like to be completely in control again. I wanted to know exactly where every dime went, and prove that I could stand alone without relying on anyone. I cooked my own meals, made a budget, and set aside a predetermined amount each month. Do not buy a house, or a new car. I merely wanted a cushion in case I decided to start my own business someday. Then, 2 years later, on a Friday evening, Brian, my best friend from college, invited me to meet at a little coffee shop. He produced a draft of a business plan, and stated that he intended to operate his own cafe. It's just a small space with real quality, not another cookie-cutter franchise. He asked if I wanted to start it together. At first I hesitated, but when I looked into Brian's eyes and realized how dedicated he was, I knew if I didn't take the leap, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. After deciding to join him, I withdrew all of my funds from the previous 2 years, and we launched our first cafe. We named it Elm and Cedar. It was situated on a quiet corner of Alberta Street in Portland. The early days were really challenging. We made our own shelving, painted the walls, rented second-hand machinery, and took turns running the shop from daylight until night. Some days it rained non-stop and we only sold 3 glasses. Some days the espresso machine broke at peak hour. We were aching all over from the night, but we still had to go through the books line by line, down to each receipt. Then the regulars started showing up. Some people stopped by every Monday morning. Some people claimed an area of the cafe and never changed their orders throughout the year. 1 year later we launched our second facility in Beaverton. Then Salem. Then Seattle. Every city taught me something new. We had to learn how to hire, manage, and preserve the brand's soul from wherever we were. And just like that, 5 years after leaving that modest apartment, and making one decision I never regretted, we now run 21 coffee shops in 5 states. My phone buzzed faintly as I sat in my normal cafe nook, my mind wandering through the memories that had recently resurfaced. A notice from Instagram came up, bringing me back to the present. I opened it out of habit, assuming I'd scroll past it and exit the app. But a few new comments on a piece from months ago gave me pause. It was a snapshot of a coffee with the simple caption, "Slow morning." I hadn't given it much attention when I posted it, but now unexpected names had made comments that I couldn't understand. Someone questioned if I still brag about my coffee shop franchise. Another ridiculed, "Still hand-making drinks with 21 stores? What a humble CEO." I read a few words and then went silent. I felt a peculiar tightening in my chest. Just then, Luca, the barista on duty, approached me. He gently pulled out his phone and said with concern, "You should see this. I think you need to know." I grabbed the phone immediately away. A newly posted video from a group called Family Drama appeared on the screen. The first image froze me. During today's lunch party, Aunt Ingrid hosted it in her living room. The footage had been cut down. It only maintained the portion where I stated that I co-founded 21 coffee shops. Following that, there was a surge of laughing, mocking remarks from my relatives, and my father screamed, "Get out of here and don't ever show your face again. You're wrecking disgrace." Then I looked at the title. It was bold and apparent at the top of the post. Paul Hart claims to run 21 coffee shops and gets tossed out for lying. As I scrolled down, the view count increased rapidly. So were the remarks. The majority came from people I had never met, but they wrote as if they knew exactly who I was. I handed back the phone to Luca. At the time I didn't feel sorry. I had a very familiar feeling. When individuals don't know the full story, they tend to believe the loudest part. And 20 minutes later, I had to close all of my social media accounts. I didn't want to argue with strangers who had too much time on their hands. At that time, I decided staying silent was the best option. My phone rang shortly after I locked down all of my social media accounts. It was Brian. I had barely set down my coffee cup when his name appeared on the screen. I responded. His voice rang out almost instantaneously, rapid and urgent. "Did you hear about what people are saying about you?" I responded right quickly, my tone calm. "Yeah, I saw it." There was a pause at the other end. Brian spoke again, this time with obvious amazement. "You saw it and you're still this calm?" I took a slow breath and answered. "What do you want me to do? Give it a few days. This will blow over." Brian's voice broke through with fury, which he didn't try to suppress. "I swear, man, you drive me crazy sometimes." Before I could say anything else, he hung up. I did not blame Brian. I understood exactly why he was unhappy. This wasn't the first time he'd gotten upset about how quiet I might be and how I let things go that he thought warranted a reaction. But I am not like him. Not every situation requires a reaction from me. Sometimes silence is the only way I know to preserve the tranquility I have left. My phone buzzed softly on the counter the next morning while I was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. It was a message from Brian. I opened it right quickly. It was short, like his other texts, with only one line. "I took care of it for you." A link was provided just below. It led directly to the Family Drama group, which had shared the edited video of me the day before. I tapped the link. A new video had just been uploaded less than 20 minutes ago. Brian was the person in the video. He was sitting in one of our coffee cafes, with the brand logo visible behind him. The video has no fancy editing or effects. It was merely a phone recording, but his voice was solid and direct. In the video he stated, his name is Paul Hart. He co-founded a chain of 21 coffee shops currently operating in 5 states. This is the business license. These are photos of the stores we built together over the last 5 years. This is an interview we did that was published in a national coffee industry magazine last year. He held each paper up to the camera. Every image, number, and phrase were well written out. At the end of the video, Brian looked directly at the camera. His voice slowed, and each syllable came through clearly and forcefully. He doesn't owe anyone an explanation. But I think it's time people heard the truth. After finishing the video, I sat and stared at the screen. Not because I was emotional, but because I knew Brian would never have made that film or shared it publicly unless he was upset on my behalf. Following that, I sent him a message. "Thank you for everything you did." After texting Brian, I returned to the video. I looked over the comments underneath it. Within 30 minutes, the post had received thousands of views and shares. There were no loud chuckles or insulting nicknames this time, unlike the day before. However, this did not imply that everyone supported me. Some individuals spoke up for me and said simply and directly, "Editing a video just to humiliate someone is one of the lowest things a family member can do." Someone else wrote, "I don't know this guy, but his friend showed paperwork and a published interview. That seems legit to me." However, a few tales raised questions. Why stay silent yesterday and only come out with proof now? Feels a little too convenient. Another person responded, "Sure, the facts are there, but the way he talked at the party did feel a bit arrogant." Reading those comments did not surprise me. I knew social media wasn't the place to settle truths and lies. It just makes one thing clear. Who controls the tale? Then, in the days that followed, I returned to my normal schedule. I still had the practice of unexpectedly visiting one of our coffee shops, waiting near the bar for a few minutes, asking a question or two, and then quietly leaving. I have been doing this for the past 5 years. Nothing had changed. I believed the storm had passed. But exactly 1 week later, it reappeared. This time, it was from the people I least wanted to see: my father and brother. I still remember it vividly. It was Tuesday, around 9 a.m. I was reviewing the payroll sheet when my phone rang. My father's name was shown on TV. I didn't hesitate. I hit decline right away. In less than a minute, a message arrived. "Your dad and Brody are waiting at the Portland store. If you don't show up, I'll keep coming back." I stared at the message. I wasn't surprised, but instead of avoiding them, I chose to go. Not to chat, but to hear what they wanted. After 30 minutes, I arrived at the cafe. When I stepped in, they were already sitting in the rear left corner, the shop's most quiet place. When they spotted me, they stood up immediately. Their faces appeared tight and uneasy. The first thing my father said was, "I'm sorry about the other day." Brody swiftly nodded and said, "Me too. I'm sorry." I addressed them directly and responded with a single sentence. "Say what you came to say." I did not need to ask twice. Brody jumped right in. His voice was flat and without emotion. "We're still family. Can you give me and Dad 10% of the company? Or if not that, maybe transfer one store to each of us. You know how it is. Dad's getting old, and my job doesn't pay well." I did not answer immediately. 5 minutes had gone before I looked up. I peered directly into their eyes and stated only one thing: "Go home and wait to hear from my lawyer." I could see a difference in their expressions as soon as I said those words. My father reclined back in his chair. Brody glanced at me in disbelief, and almost relieved. They believed I had agreed. They assumed paperwork was on its way. They had no idea, however, that what they were about to receive would stun them more than anything they had expected. Right after they left the coffee shop, I contacted Eric, the legal counsel for the coffee business Brian and I co-owned. I explained exactly what had transpired. There are no extra words, no detours. When I finished describing, Eric's voice was steady and firm on the other end. "Leave it to me. I know what to do. It'll be done in 2 days." I didn't ask anything else. I knew him well. When Eric mentioned 2 days, he did not mean 2.5. He meant not a minute late. And he was correct. 2 days later, early in the morning, my phone called again. It was Eric, this time in his typical report-style voice. "The letter has been delivered as requested. The originals were handed directly to them with full confirmation." I thanked him and said nothing else. But I had a feeling about what was going to happen next. And I was correct. That afternoon, while I was at the office reading inventory reports, the phone rang again. This time, it was my father. I responded because I wanted to know what his tone would be. When I picked up, his voice cut through the line, piercing and aggressive. "You bastard! Is this how you treat your father?" I responded slowly and clearly, each word thoughtful. "I don't have a father. You've got the wrong person. And don't forget what my lawyer instructed." I did not wait for his reaction. I hung up instantly. Then I accessed my contacts and blocked both his and Brody's numbers. I didn't do anything in anger. I did it because I understood where his wrath sprang from. It was not due to pain. It stemmed from disappointment. They were expecting a transfer form, a share, and a last-minute compromise from me. But what they held was a legally binding no-contact order, followed with Eric's formal cease-and-desist letter. The wording was extremely clear. If they continued to interfere with or disturb the operations of the coffee business, the legal team would file a lawsuit. And if that happened, even selling the house Brody owned wouldn't be enough to offset the losses. The next days were the first that seemed completely peaceful. No more unexpected calls in the early morning. Every time my phone rang, I felt less anxious. No more guarded stares from folks who used to call me family. I went to work. We stopped by the stores. I sat in my normal nook, with a cup of coffee that was just hot enough. And for the first time in years, I wasn't concerned about who might appear out of nowhere. Some would argue that I was being very harsh, and should have been more forgiving and open. I should have given it up for the sake of my family. However, Forgiveness does not always imply letting things go. It's about knowing when to stop. I did not cut anyone off. I just stopped and left the door wide open. Not every person who walks in deserves to stay. I also learned from my mistakes. Don't rush to share your success, especially with those who don't ask out of concern, but rather out of calculation. Silence does not indicate weakness. It's the best shield for safeguarding the things that are actually important. It took me a long time to comprehend this. Controlling everything does not provide peace. It occurs when you finally stop allowing the wrong things into your life. And before I conclude today's narrative, I'd like to leave you with a question. This one's for you, the listener who stuck with me till the end. What would you have done if you were in my place at Aunt Ingrid's Christmas dinner, surrounded by relatives hurling barbs and disparaging comments, and everyone looked at you as if you were nothing more than someone with a regular job? Would you have stepped up, like I did, and spoken the truth? That you are the co-founder of 21 coffee shops, allowing the facts to speak for themselves? Or would you have remained silent, endured the derision, and retained the peace you fought so hard to preserve all these years?